Welcome. My name's JERELL. I've been here for about 4.5 years in your church family, in your community, serving as the student pastor, middle school, high school, college, young adult kids, and it's been just an absolute blessing and an absolute joy. And if you don't know, our middle schoolers and our high schoolers are fantastic and intelligent, and it's a great group of kids to be able to pastor. So if you have your Bibles, would you please turn to the book of Ruth, or your apps, I suppose. We're going to start in chapter 3. And we're just going to jump right in. I'm going to try to catch you up to speed. If you don't know, we are preaching through the book of Ruth. We're in chapter 3 today. It's part 4 of a 5-part series. During Pete's absence, Nathan Riley, our worship pastor, has been spearheading a team of me, Linda, and Evan Hendricks, as well as Amy Kasari, to prayerfully discern what God might have for us and our community in the book of Ruth and preach through as a team. And so a lot of our ideas are shared. They're on the back end of discussion and deliberation about what it looks like to hear the book of Ruth and apply it to our lives this morning. So by way of catch-up, I really want to show this family tree because we talk about Ruth and Naomi and Elimelech and all these weird people's names, and I'm a visual person, so I just like to look at this family tree. So a little bit of the backstory is that Elimelech and Naomi are Israelites living in Bethlehem during the time of Judges. As you know, the time of Judges was a really tumultuous time in Israelite history. There's this cycle of disobedience from the nation, the judgment of God, repentance, and restoration back to living as a community of blessing for their neighbors. They got a little lax, and then that cycle would repeat itself. And so typically what happened was there was a famine by way of God's judgment. And so this particular family, Elimelech and Naomi, flee Bethlehem, which means bread, and flee a place of food and head over here to Moab, which is kind of enemy territory. There's a long history of Moab and Israel in conflict. And so this can be interpreted as a move by Elimelech that maybe didn't show faith in God. And perhaps, most likely, Naomi was passive in this, and she had to go with her family, which included her 2 sons. When they get to Moab, Elimelech dies, and then 10 years pass. Naomi's sons marry Moabite women, and then they die. And so this puts Naomi in a really peculiar position. She's experienced a significant amount of loss, where their new family tree looks something like this, where there's just 2 remaining. Orpah decides to stay in Moab, and Naomi, from kind of this bitter, very lamentful and broken place, decides to return to Israel on her own. And she insists that Ruth does not go with her, but as we know, Ruth does go with her. So they return back to Israel, just the 2 of them. And we encounter a really unique state from Naomi in this condition. She's encountered great loss. Her name, Naomi, means pleasant. But she is in a condition of bitterness, I think deep, paralyzing anxiety and depression, a loss of identity, a loss of geographical home, a loss of her family. And it's easy to just skim over and he died, then they died, and then they left, and then she went back. But over the course of 10 to 15 years, think of the trauma and just the kind of loss of identity that Naomi would encounter, which leads her to say something like this, which is in Ruth 1:20. Don't call me Naomi when she returns, which means pleasant. Rather call me Mara, which means bitter. So she's changing her entire identity, not just a name, who she is as a person, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. So why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. It's really interesting that she does not shy away from blaming God for her problems. Very directly, even using the word Almighty, almost in juxtaposition of God, who has all this power, you have not shown that power to me. Call me bitter. Interestingly enough, though, Ruth follows Naomi back to Israel, calling her God, Naomi's God, Ruth's God. And what's really interesting is that expression of Naomi's pursuit of Yahweh through lament is actually what grounds the faith of Ruth. When Naomi's life is most bitter and she's blaming God, somehow the way Naomi lamented and the way Naomi encountered suffering was a beacon of hope for Ruth, so much that she would become loyal and committed and covenant with Naomi at a personal level and even at a faith level, so that Naomi would not be alone. The famous statement is Ruth 1:16, where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay, which we'll come back to in a little bit, about perhaps a deeper meaning to that. So their current condition is Naomi. Gosh, there's so many different names. Naomi, I view her as sitting in a dark corner in their home, unable to move and unable to function at a normal level of human functioning, so much so that Ruth alone takes initiative to provide food through this process called gleaning. And so God has initiated some social structures within the nation of Israel so they could bless the marginalized and those who live on the fringe, where rich landowners would leave certain amount of crops as well as the remnants of the harvest so that others could come and take those for their daily sustenance. And so Ruth and Naomi are just in this day by day, week by week, hard, gritty work. As Linda said, Ruth is wearing a vintage romper with her hair up, and it's all dirty, and she's carrying like sheaves back to Ruth, who is in this state of deep spiritual, emotional, and identity depression. So Naomi hears about this man, Boaz, who Ruth has been working for, and the light bulbs start to go off. And here's where we see the smallest glimmer of hope enter into the soul of Naomi. And that's where we're going to jump into the story today in chapter 3, verse 1, when Naomi introduces this idea to Ruth of a family redeemer or a kinsman redeemer. So let's look at chapter 3, verse 1. One day, Ruth's mother-in-law, Naomi, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you." And that word home literally means rest or place of security, not just a house, a home, where you will be well provided for. We see again the selfless posture of Naomi. Now, Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. So she's already mentioned this idea of a kinsman redeemer in chapter 2, verse 20. She says, "This man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Depending on our translation, it might say kinsman redeemer or family redeemer. Let me just stop and take a moment to explain what this is. Whenever I teach Ruth to middle schoolers and high schoolers, this is the thing that they can never understand. And honestly, as adults, don't tell anyone, but it was like, what is this? What is this family redeemer situation? So a family redeemer is basically this: someone who has the obligation to redeem a relative in serious difficulty. Primarily, we see this out of Leviticus chapter 25, where if someone in your extended family has lost land and you have the ability to buy it back, you are under obligation to buy it back to keep the land in your family. If someone has been sold as a slave and you have the ability to buy them back, which is what the word redeem means, you would literally buy them back so they can stay in your family. If someone is needy or helpless and needs food or security or some way to find social structures to be provided for, and you have that capacity, you are under the obligation to buy them back into your family. It's a really awesome, unique way that God's law is not just this weird hierarchy of that would be cool if, or God's just floating up there making weird rules that we have to follow, but he's concerned about the flourishing and the prosperity of his community so that Israel might be a blessed people and be able to bless those around them. Deuteronomy also notes this idea of marriage, whereas if your brother dies, you would marry his spouse to keep that family name going, which is not something we practice here. Maybe we should start. Nope. And so here's the idea that God is saying this: know your family, value your family. If you are wealthy or secure or privileged, God has asked you to extend hospitality to your own family, regardless of the inconvenience or sacrifice. And so we see two unique expressions that this community is living according to the flourishing law of God, where there are landowners who are allowing the poor to glean, And there are people in a place of privilege who are leveraging that for the marginalized to keep family systems alive and social structures alive, that Israel itself is a community of blessing and that therefore extends outside to the neighbors around them, including Ruth, who is a foreigner, a Moabite, who encounters this blessing. And so what I really want to dive into first is the condition of Naomi's heart, that this is a huge step for her. I think Naomi is on the back burner of 15 years of deep spiritual depression, and this is the first introduction of light and hope that God has sovereignly provided for this family. And so Naomi has made this point very clear. And the first thing Naomi does is resists the temptation to hide her true feelings from God. She resists the temptation to buffer, to feel something and think something to God or about God and not tell him as sharply and poignantly as she feels it. So she has made a clear point to blame God. She is bitter at God. She is bitter at her deceased husband. She is bitter at the situation, bitter at herself. Naomi, in the too fast to process tumble of life, from the darkest of corners, from the deepest place of emptiness and exhaustion, has audaciously peeled back a layer of her heart, and she finds the courage to once more challenge the steadfast love of Yahweh. An interesting quote from Carolyn Curtis James says this, and many people compare Naomi as kind of to Job as kind of the female counterpart to the suffering of Job. An honest reading of the Bible reveals a God who does not shy away from awkward questions. In fact, he almost seems to welcome them. Ruth met God in her pain and gained a deeper kind of trust in him that weathers adversity and refuses to let go of God. Her story coaxes us to get down to the business of wrestling with God instead of chasing rainbows, and to employ the same kind of brutal honesty that she did, if we dare. And what's interesting is that posture that that Naomi, this is going to happen the rest of the sermon, just mixing them up. Person A, person B. Naomi encounters this suffering, which invites Ruth into it, which is another observation about Naomi, is that she resists the temptation to hide her true emptiness from her community. From this place of darkness, she is honest with God, and she is vulnerable with her community, and when they offer to help, she lets them. We often walk the thin line between our best selves and our worst selves. What should we do with our dueling emotions and identities? I don't know if you're like me, sometimes you feel like you're walking this very narrow line between barely holding it together and then entirely falling apart. And I think if you've been in the Christian community enough, maybe you've been in environments or situations where you've been able to just let go. And whatever sense of control or fear that's causing us to white knuckle and keep trying to fight for our own emotional security in isolation from the community, when you finally can encounter a safe place to say how you really feel to trusted followers of God, I think that is where you find the life, and that's what Naomi did. I think this is countercultural. I think this is one great way that the church can be an expression and a light of God's kingdom in our society, that aside from maybe some too much information, Instagram, social media posts, for the most part, in person, we keep to ourselves. When we don't allow people to know our brokenness and help, we muffle the voice of God's witness on earth. This is an opportunity for us, Antioch, to be honest with one another and honest with God, that those in Bend and in Central Oregon might say, man, I don't know about their God, but I know about their community, and that sounds like a good place to be. When life is bitter, find blessing in the community of God and wait for him to do something beyond your control. When you find yourself on that frail line between falling apart and holding it together, feel free to fall apart into the community of God and be honest with God about it. Are there conversations that you need to have? Antioch, is there a culture that we need to reorient here? whereas we hustle into the lobby at 10:05 with our kids and someone asks you how you're doing, and there's that moment, I don't know. Do I want to tell you how I'm really doing, or I just want to say good? I encounter this with our high school students a lot, where I know maybe some of the backstory of what's going on in their family, and they walk up the stairs of Six and Clay, and we're a hugging kind of youth group, so I'll give them a hug, like, how you doing, dude? Great. Like, I know you're not. I know you're not doing great, and I don't know what prevents us from telling someone that, but I feel like as a community, that's something that would give hope. So Naomi has hope. And she's going to initiate this really awkward plan with Ruth. And I know a lot of you only came to chapter 3 so you could hear what we say about the threshing floor. That's okay. We're going to get to it, and we're not going to sanitize it, and I'm not going to tell you the answer either. So read some commentaries. And so she says, let's make a plan and make it happen. And so basically she says, all right, Ruth, here's what we're going to do. Boaz is going to be on the threshing floor tonight, winnowing barley. It's the barley harvest, and so if you're not familiar with ancient Near Eastern threshing floor etiquette, which maybe a few of you aren't, here's how it works. You just take off your shirt, flex your muscles, grab a pitchfork. That was a joke. Grab a pitchfork, grab all the barley, chuck it up in the air at the right time of night where the wind is strong enough but not too strong. The grain is heaviest. It falls down right back onto the floor, which is a big smooth surface or a big rock. The straw is a little bit heavier. It floats down and lands over here. And then the chaff, which I always want to say that wrong, floats a little further and lands over here. And so basically you're manually removing the grain from the barley or the wheat. And so we don't know if Boaz was good looking or how old he was, but we know he had very built shoulders and lats from this process. So just a little mental image as we continue. And so Naomi says, hey, go down to this floor, and you are basically going to make yourself presentable as someone who he would want to redeem, so that he could redeem our family. And so she says, put your hair up, put on some perfume, put on some of your best clothes. And some scholars soften that and just say she's now dressing no longer like someone who would glean, but someone who is married to a landowner. It's kind of an identity change for her, as well as an impetus for Boaz to marry her. And so she says, go, wait till he's sleeping, scope it out, lie down by his feet, uncover his feet, and just wait. And whatever he does tell you to do, just do it. So parents, just take note. This is great advice for the first date. Sneak into his bed, uncover his feet, and lay there. And whatever he says, you just do it. All right? So a little interesting, what's going on here? Is this cultural? Is this not? And so let's pick up the story. In chapter 7, we hear not just Naomi's plan, but what actually happens. Verse 7, when Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, very good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lay down. Sticking to the plan, Ruth. You got this. In the middle of the night, something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. Oh, man, that's the worst. He says, who are you? I am your servant Ruth, she says. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family. And so there's really two purposes that Ruth is hoping to accomplish through this obscure and strange, perhaps edgy act. The purpose number one is the safe purpose. To inspire Boaz to accept this opportunity to redeem his family. She's presenting herself not as someone gleaning, but as someone that he could marry. And then it seems, we'll find out later, that Boaz already had been thinking in this way. And so I think in the mind of Boaz, he's standing at the gap between, it's one thing to be generous to someone by providing them food or protection or care or guidance, just kind of the standard baseline generous moral obligation he would have just as a follower of God in this community, of the gleaning process. It's a whole other thing to marry that person. And it's a new level of humanizing Ruth. she would then become an equal with him, and it would cost him quite a bit. He needs to make up his mind. Do I want to marry this person? Do I want to share resources with her family? Is this a commitment I want to make to fully humanize and equal myself to Ruth, a foreign Moabitess, so that God's blessing might spread to this community? And what's interesting is I think Ruth knows this. In chapter 3:9, she says, "Spread the corner of your garment over me." This is the same phrase that Linda talked on last week about taking refuge in the wings of God. And so she's basically saying, don't just keep me warm tonight in this awkward threshing floor situation, but may you provide for me. May I and my family be able to enter under your wing and under your providence and under your care. The second purpose is the edgy purpose, and it's to really inspire Boaz to accept this opportunity to redeem his family. In other words, in case you can't picture Boaz, what it might be like to be married to me, here you go. I smell good. I got my eyeliner on. My hair's down. I like to translate some of these Hebrew words as spooning, very romantic encounter on the threshing floor. And it's really the sketchy element in the room. We want to know, how far did they go? How far is too far, Boaz? Where's your boundaries? And I think, I've read a bunch of commentaries on this, and the conservative ones are finding every way to take the Hebrew and make it sound like they just had a nice little tea party. The more edgy ones are taking these words and interpreting them in ways that seem maybe there was some encountering happening and some things that maybe wouldn't be in our G-rated version of the Bible. But as we know, the Bible hasn't ever shied away from allowing God to work through and redeem kind of the messy and broken parts of our lives, that somehow our lack of perfection would hinder God from working through us. We look at David and Bathsheba as kind of the token story of God takes our messy human existence and works through it. And so the narrator, doesn't tell us what happens. And so I think our Western minds don't have answers to the questions that we're asking, and that's totally fine by me. I'll leave it up to your interpretation. So basically, if you think it's conservative, sit over here. No, I'm just kidding. You don't have to do that. We don't need to distill the humanity from the story of God. God has always worked through sketchy resumes to build his kingdom and sustain his redemption. And so, to boil it down, Ruth is saying, will you marry me? Will you become our family redeemer? And let's find out what Boaz does. In verse 10, he says this: "The Lord bless you, my daughter." Not something you maybe want to say, my daughter, but that's what he says. He replied, "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." So let's stop. There are three things that Boaz does to show us his integrity. The first is that he recognizes the character of Ruth. Boaz has been upheld as a man of blameless character, someone who is embodying the shalom law of God to bless his community and those around him. And so I really do think a man of character sees a woman of character, and there is some form of connection and recognition there. And what's interesting to note is that Boaz has been observing this. The whole town has been observing this. I think there's something, the first step towards working for the flourishing of the marginalized is to see them, is to recognize what's going on, to step back, slow down, and recognize, man, Ruth is working day in and day out to care for her mother-in-law, Naomi. She's working hard. She's working with integrity. And Boaz sees that and recognizes Ruth as a woman of noble character, which sounds strangely similar to Proverbs 31. Is anyone familiar with kind of the classic Proverbs 31, wife of noble character thing? And what's interesting is what we want to do is we want to say, hey, Ruth is like this proverb. But what's really interesting is that Ruth is the great-grandma of Solomon, who is attributed to writing the Proverbs. And the interesting line is that her fame is known at the city gates where Boaz says, everyone in the city knows about you, and later on the whole kinsman redeemer process happens at the city gates, which is really interesting that a lot of people suggest that Solomon is actually writing about his legendary great-great-grandmother, Ruth, as this woman of noble character with hard work, with creativity, engaging in the culture of the world and providing for her family, which sounds exactly like Ruth. So Boaz sees the character of Ruth. Secondly, he commits to redeeming the family. So here in verse 12, he says, although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of your family, there is another who is more closely related than I am. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until the morning. And so what's really funny is Boaz already knows there's someone else in line, which means he's already been thinking about it, which means over the last few weeks, maybe years, he's been, man, should I redeem Ruth's family? And it's been something that's been on his mind and in his heart. And the funny thing is I think Naomi's plan actually works. It kind of pushes him over the edge to take the final initiative and saying, Ruth, I actually will marry you. I actually will redeem your family. But another interesting point is that he doesn't cut any corners here. He doesn't just try to cheat the system. Now that he kind of has his own desires stirred, he still sticks to the letter of the law and follows the protocol of their culture, which I think is another testament to his character. It's not just he's following the laws when it's difficult, but he's following the laws when he still wants to do something else. Last is he preserves the reputation of Ruth. Whether or not he knows what to do with this whole situation that apparently worked. Now he has a woman on his threshing floor in the night, and it would just look really sketchy, if the walk of shame happened, and culturally, like, what's up with Ruth and Boaz? And so he sees this. He knows how this could be interpreted in the community, and so he says, hey, wait here, not in the middle of the night, but right at dusk before it gets too light, and I want you to leave at this point. And not only does he preserve the reputation of Ruth, he still provides for the family. So marrying Ruth isn't just about providing for Ruth, it's about providing for Naomi. And so in traditional Boaz form, before she leaves, he says, here, take some more food for the week. So in that weird moment, Boaz is still caring about Ruth and still caring about Naomi, which is exactly the type of person that should be the kinsman redeemer, and exactly the type of person that Israel needs, I think we need, to create shalom and blessing within our community. Boaz isn't just an awesome dude. He is someone who lives according to the law of God, and that isn't entirely binding for him. It's freeing for him to love the community and bless those around him. And so we get to the debrief. You got to go back to your girlfriends, talk about how it went down. That was also kind of a joke. So in verse 16, when Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, how did it go, my daughter? Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, he gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. And that's the type of guy you want for your daughter-in-law in a strange way. Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. What's interesting is that when Naomi says, how did it go, my daughter? Another way to translate that is, who are you, my daughter? Who are you? In one sense, she means, are you a gleaner still? Or are you engaged? Who are you now? Who is your identity? Did he say yes? Did he say no? How awkward was it? How did it go? Did our plan work? But I think the deeper meaning is really a reflection for Naomi on the blessing that Ruth is for her. And so she says, who are you, in the sense that, how could you, Ruth, a young Moabite widow, offer such sweet providence for my bitter soul? Naomi is backtracking and reflecting on how God just dropped Naomi into her life and has put Naomi on her shoulders and has carried her into a place of blessing and gone with her wherever she is, whether that's depression, or hope. And so I wonder again, when life is bitter, how can we find blessing in the community of God and wait for him to do something beyond our control? What's interesting is that if we backtrack and look at the entire story, we see Naomi over here kind of caught up in her bitterness and in her depression and in her kind of just spiritual lostness. And we see Ruth say, I am going to covenant with you. Wherever you go, I will go. And she takes Naomi and she puts her on her back and she feels that weight and she enters into her bitterness and she carries her step by step in the direction of her flourishing. And that includes probably a lot of nights of pastoral expression and hard daily work to provide food. And Ruth gets to this point where her strength is starting to waver and it's unsustainable to work this hard just to survive in this community. And then you have Boaz here saying, man, Ruth, wherever you go, I will go. And he steps into the position of Ruth and equalizes her with him and takes the weight of Naomi and the weight of Ruth and straps it on his back and takes daily steps forward towards the flourishing of the community and of God. And friends, I think this is exactly what Jesus does for us when he says, come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That's the invitation of our Jesus, that we would challenge the faithfulness of God and present ourselves as vulnerable to the community so that Jesus, through his body and his temple and his church and the Christian community, can say, wherever you go, I will go. I will meet you in the darkest moments. I will meet you in your accusations and in your bitterness, and I will take that yoke and I will carry it. And we will take steps daily forward towards the prosperity of you and towards the prosperity of the community. And so, friends, that is the Jesus that we have today. And I'm not sure how you feel, but I would imagine that there are many Naomis and Ruths in this room. You might be in a state of spiritual depression. Your faith might be on the rocks and you're doubting it. You might be exhausted because you volunteer in like 13 ministries here and you have 18 kids and you work 60-hour weeks and you don't see a light at the end of the tunnel. And so I invite you to not withhold those emotions and stay there, but to voice them strongly and sharply to God and then create a platform for your community to love you through that vulnerability. And so I think we actually do the opposite. Like, what if Naomi didn't lament well and didn't share that with Ruth? How would Ruth have known to help? And what if Ruth wasn't public in the way she needed help and they took initiative to initiate the kinsman redeemer process? And what if Boaz didn't see that? This could be an entirely different story. And so are you Naomi today? Do you need our Jesus to meet you in that brokenness? Do you need to voice your sharp concerns to him? And then do you need to find vulnerability and prosperity in the Christian community? I know it can be difficult to share some of our deepest pains. There's a sense of shame or just a lack of energy or a distrust. I don't think that the person that I give that personal information with will handle it well. And there might be people that won't. But I really, really encourage you, Antioch, like for real, like what if we were a community that lamented well and allowed the community around us to put us on our backs and carry us step by step toward the flourishing of our God? What if the pathway to your flourishing includes a deeper level of honesty with God and vulnerability with your trusted community? Friends, as we come to the table today and receive communion as a community, I really encourage you to not receive this alone, to find someone next to you, take some moments, pray some prayers, give some honest thoughts to God, and we say here that the table is open for sinners. The table is open for people who are willing to humble themselves, recognize that they need God, and they need a Savior. And we have promises that this is a tangible, recognized means of Jesus' grace to your soul. You might not feel anything crazy, but we are trusting that Jesus is meeting you in your deepest spiritual need, deepest emotional need, deepest practical need, and to wait for him to act. We don't need to try to move God's kingdom along for him. He can withstand the flaming arrows of your lament as long as you can send him his way. Sound good? Let's pray. Father, I am incredibly grateful for the Antioch community, the way that in so many ways I see us living this. And as we do our best to engage in our own personal brokenness and work together towards the flourishing of this church and this city, would you give us courage, give us audacity to challenge you to do what only you can do, to step into our lives in the midst of the tears and our resistance to letting go of our white knuckles. Would you bring this community together as an authentic expression of your future kingdom on earth? Would you meet us in the sacraments today, in the prayers, in the songs? We love you in Christ's name. Amen.